Welcome. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into some really fundamental questions, looking at the philosophical roots of modern science and how they shape our struggle to understand consciousness.
We'll be drawing heavily from Philip Goff's book, Galileo's Error. It's a fascinating work that revisits science's history to, well, grapple with why consciousness remains such a persistent puzzle.
Right. And this isn't just abstract theorizing, is it? It pushes you to rethink our whole place in the universe, the nature of reality itself.
Absolutely. Our mission here is really to unpack the core arguments Goff presents. You'll find some surprising links, I think, between how science works, philosophy, and this deep mystery of subjective experience.
So let's start with Galileo. Most people think of him, telescopes, experiments.
The champion of the experimental method, yes.
Hmm.
But Goff argues quite persuasively that his philosophical contribution was perhaps even more impactful, certainly for how science developed.
Okay, how so? What was his philosophical move?
Well, the standard picture is Galileo the observer, but Goff highlights Galileo the philosopher, who essentially established the framework for modern science by deciding what science should study. He excluded sensory qualities, colors, sounds, tastes, smells from the domain of physics.
Ah, okay. So science should focus only on the measurable, the quantifiable aspects.
Precisely. Shape, size, motion, location, things you can describe with mathematics. These subjective qualities, the what it's like of experience, were placed, effectively, inside the conscious mind, outside the scope of physical science itself.
And that worked incredibly well for physics, obviously.
Phenomenally well. But, and this is Goff's central point, it created a massive problem down the line when we tried to understand consciousness itself. Because consciousness is fundamentally about those very qualities Galileo bracketed out.
Right. Goff has that great line, imagining Galileo looking at our struggles today.
Yes. He says Galileo would say, "Of course you are struggling. I designed physical science to deal with quantities, not qualities." It really captures the dilemma.
It does. And Goff shows Galileo wasn't just an experimenter by looking at his arguments, like the one against Aristotle on falling objects. That's a perfect example. Aristotle believed heavier things fall faster,
Yeah.
which kind of matches rough intuition,
Just
right?
drop a feather in a rock.
Exactly. But Galileo dismantled this purely through logic, a thought experiment, even before the famous Leaning Tower demonstration, which might not have even happened as described.
Okay, walk us through the thought experiment. The elephant and the bowling ball.
Right. Imagine an elephant and a bowling ball. According to Aristotle, the heavier elephant falls faster. Now Galileo says, what if you chain them together?
Okay.
Well, on the one hand, the slower bowling ball should act like a drag, slowing the elephant down, so the combined system falls slower than the elephant alone.
Makes sense.
But on the other hand, the combined system, elephant plus chain plus bowling ball, is now heavier than the elephant alone. So, according to Aristotle's own rule, it should fall faster.
Ah, I see. You get two completely opposite conclusions from the same starting point. A logical contradiction revealed purely by philosophical reasoning. It shows the power of thought, independent of immediate experiment, to uncover truths about the world. It underlines Goff's view of Galileo as a major philosophical force.
And understanding that philosophical move helps us see why consciousness became such a sticking point later on.
Say mess and solely. Which brings us squarely to what David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem, not the easy problems like how the brain processes information or controls behavior.
No, those are complex, but we sort of see how science could tackle them. The hard problem is different. It's why does all that physical processing, all that neural activity feel like anything from the inside? Why is there subjective experience at all?
Why aren't we just incredibly complex biological robots performing functions without any inner life?
That's the core of it. And one classic response, which has a lot of intuitive pull, is dualism.
The idea that mind and body are fundamentally different things, a non-physical mind connected to a physical brain.
Yes. The hard problem is different. It's why does all that brain activity feel like anything from the inside? Why is there subjective experience at all?
Why, the inner movie, the qualia.
Exactly. Why isn't it all just processing in the dark, functionally the same, but without any feeling? That's the puzzle.
Naturalistic dualism. What's the idea there? Is it like traditional soul stuff?
Not exactly like traditional substance dualism. Naturalistic dualism, especially Chalmers' version, doesn't necessarily posit a separate substance. It suggests consciousness is a fundamental property of reality.
Like space-time or electromagnetism.
Sort of, yes. A basic ingredient of the universe, alongside the physical properties science usually deals with, it accepts that subjective experience seems irreducible, maybe not fully explainable just by physics as we know it.
But, okay, doesn't that just bring back the old problem, the interaction problem? If consciousness is fundamental, but somehow non-physical in the usual sense, how does it interact with the physical brain?
That is absolutely the challenge. How does a non-physical property cause neurons to fire? Or how do neurons firing give rise to this property? It's tough.
Seems like a major stumbling block.
It is. But the sources offer an interesting counterpoint, drawing on David Hume.
Ah, Hume on causation. How does that apply?
The idea is maybe our difficulty understanding mind-body interaction isn't unique to dualism. Hume pointed out we never directly perceive causation anyway, even in simple physics. We just see events constantly happening together.
So we see the cue ball hit the 8-ball and the 8-ball moves. We infer causation.
Right. We don't see the causal link itself. So perhaps our struggle with mind-brain interaction is part of a bigger mystery about how anything fundamentally interacts or causes anything else.
Reframes it. It's not just a problem for dualism, but maybe a limit of our understanding of causality itself.
Potentially. The sources also mention evidence against what's called interventionist dualism.
Okay, what's that?
That's the stronger idea that a non-physical mind actively intervenes in the brain, making neurons fire in ways physical laws alone wouldn't predict.
Like a little ghost pushing buttons in the brain.
Kind of, yeah. The argument against it comes from neuroscience. As we study the brain more, we don't seem to find these anomalous events physical effects without physical causes. The physical system seems causally closed, or at least there's no clear evidence of outside meddling.
Which pushes against that strong interventionist idea.
Goff uses the analogy of a drone pilot. The pilot, the mind, controls the drone, the body, and gets feedback from it, but they are distinct entities. The pilot isn't made of the same stuff as the drone.
You could see the appeal. It seems to honor our feeling that thoughts and sensations are just different from physical stuff.
It does resonate with that intuition. But dualism faces its own serious challenges. The main one being, how exactly does this non-physical mind interact with the physical brain?
The interaction problem.
Right.
If the mind isn't physical, how does it make neurons fire? Or how do physical events in the brain create non-physical feelings?
It's a tough nut to crack. And related to that is the worry about energy conservation. If a non-physical mind influences the brain, wouldn't that mean injecting energy into the physical world, violating a fundamental law of physics?
Dennett and others have really pushed that objection.
They have, though Goff points out that it's not necessarily a knockout blow. Dualists could argue there are specific psychophysical laws governing the interaction that do respect energy conservation, just like other physical laws work together. It's not logically impossible.
Okay. So it remains a hurdle, but maybe not an absolute barrier. And there are versions like Chalmers' naturalistic dualism trying to bridge this gap somehow.
Right. Acknowledging consciousness is fundamental, even if the interaction mechanism is still mysterious.
Okay, so if dualism is tricky, what's the main alternative? Materialism.
Materialism or physicalism, the view that everything, including consciousness, is ultimately physical. Consciousness is just what the brain does. It's a product of complex physical processes in our heads.
No extra non-physical stuff needed.
Now, Goff notes some philosophers, like Ladyman and Ross or Patricia Churchland, are pretty skeptical of purely philosophical arguments about consciousness that aren't tied closely to neuroscience.
They think philosophy without science here is just armchair speculation.
Kind of. They argue science is the only real way to figure out the mind. But Goff pushes back, reminding us that philosophy provides essential tools even for science, like basic logic, the law of non-contradiction, for instance. We know something can't be both a planet and not a planet at the same time without doing any experiments.
Logic underpins everything, sure. And philosophy uses thought experiments to test the limits of concepts, right? Like challenging materialism.
And two classic ones Goff discusses are the knowledge argument, black and white Mary, and the zombie argument.
Okay, let's take Mary first. The brilliant neuroscientist raised in a black and white room.
That's the one. She knows every single physical fact there is to know about color vision, wavelengths, photoreceptors, neural pathways, everything. But she's never actually seen color.
Then, one day, she's let out of the room and sees a red tomato for the first time.
The question is, does she learn anything new?
The argument says yes. She learns what it's like to see red. And if she learned something new, then the physical facts she knew before weren't the whole story about color experience.
which implies conscious experience, the qualitative aspect, involves something more than just physical facts. A direct challenge to materialism's claim to completeness.
Of course, materialists like Dennett have responses.
Yeah.
He has that funny blue banana counter-argument, doesn't he?
He does. Dennett argues if Mary really knew everything physical, she wouldn't be surprised. She'd see a blue banana someone painted and say, ah, trying to trick me. I know bananas are yellow, but this one reflects wavelengths corresponding to blue. The idea is complete physical knowledge would include anticipating the experience.
It's a debate about what knowing all physical facts truly entails.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what about the other challenge, philosophical zombies?
This one is maybe even more counterintuitive. Imagine a being that is physically identical to you or me, atom for atom. Behaves identically, talks identically, reacts identically to pain stimuli.
Good.
But on the inside, there's nothing. No subjective experience, lights are off. It's just an incredibly sophisticated automaton mimicking consciousness. Philosophical zombie.
Okay, creepy concept.
Yep.
But what's the argument?
The argument hinges on whether such a zombie is even logically conceivable. Is there any inherent contradiction in the idea of a physical duplicate without consciousness?
It doesn't immediately seem contradictory, just weird.
Right. And if a zombie is conceivable, even if not actually possible in our world, the argument goes, then physical properties alone don't logically necessitate consciousness. Because here you have all the physical properties, but consciousness is absent.
Based on the idea that if two things are truly identical, like consciousness and certain brain states, as materialism claims, you can't logically have one without the other.
It uses the identity principle. If A is identical to B, then A cannot exist without B. The conceivability of zombies suggests consciousness isn't simply identical to physical states, challenging materialism at its core.
So it highlights this apparent gap between physical description and subjective feeling.
Goff argues these thought experiments show materialism struggles to really account for the qualitative nature of experience. It doesn't solve the hard problem, it perhaps sidesteps it.
Okay, so if dualism has the interaction problem, and materialism struggles with qualia and zombies, where does that leave us? Goff brings in panpsychism.
Panpsychism, yes.
Yeah.
An ancient idea getting renewed attention. The core claim is that consciousness isn't something that emerges only in complex brains, but is a fundamental property of matter itself.
So even fundamental particles, like electrons or quarks, have some form of consciousness. That sounds pretty wild.
It does at first hearing, but it's usually proposed that this fundamental consciousness is incredibly simple, maybe not even recognizable as thought or feeling as we know it, more like a rudimentary flicker of subjectivity.
How do proponents justify this?
Goff discusses the Russell-Eddington approach. They argued that physics, fundamentally, only tells us what matter does, how it behaves, interacts, relates to other matter, its relational properties.
Like an electron's mass, charge, spin?
But physics doesn't tell us what matter is in itself, its intrinsic nature. Goff uses the analogy of a chess piece. Physics gives you the rules of how the bishop moves, what it does, but not what it's made of intrinsically. Wood, plastic.
So there must be some intrinsic nature to matter, even if physics doesn't describe it.
That's the idea. And then Eddington adds what Goff calls the small window argument. We have direct access to the intrinsic nature of one piece of matter, our own brain. And we know that part of its intrinsic nature involves consciousness.
Okay.
So the panpsychist leap is to suggest that this consciousness we find in brain matter is actually revealing the intrinsic nature of matter more generally. Perhaps all matter at its core has some form of proto-consciousness, which gets incredibly complex in brains, but is fundamentally present everywhere.
So it's not like an electron is thinking philosophical thoughts.
Definitely not. It's about a very basic level of experience. And importantly, modern panpsychism isn't usually dualistic. It's not saying particles have physical properties plus separate conscious properties. It's more that consciousness is the intrinsic qualitative reality of the physical.
A unified view. Goff mentions integrated information theory, IIP, as potentially relevant here.
Yes, briefly. IIT is the scientific theory proposing that consciousness is related to the amount of integrated information in a system. It provides a mathematical framework, and interestingly, it predicts consciousness might be quite widespread, potentially arising in systems we don't normally think of as conscious if they have the right kind of information integration. It could offer a way to think about how simple consciousness combines.
Which leads to the big question for panpsychism, the combination problem.
The major challenge, yes. If fundamental particles have tiny bits of simple consciousness, how do these micro experiences combine to form the rich, unified, complex consciousness that you and I experience. How do quark experiences add up to chocolate experiences?
It seems like a very hard problem, too.
It is. Goff acknowledges it's a serious challenge, but he distinguishes it from what he calls the materialist gap, the seemingly unbridgeable gap between purely quantitative physics and any quality at all. The panpsychist gap is about combining simple qualities into complex ones, which, Goff suggests, might be a more tractable within consciousness problem, rather than getting consciousness from non-consciousness.
And he points to things like split brain studies as maybe offering clues.
Potentially. Studying patients where the connection between brain hemispheres is severed reveals strange splits in awareness and control. It's like consciousness can become decombined. Goff mentions Roloff's idea that understanding how consciousness can break apart might shed light on how it normally binds together.
Interesting angle. So moving towards the broader implications, Goff touches on free will and the Libet experiments.
Right. Those experiments seem to show brain activity initiating an action before the person felt they consciously decided to act. Some took this as evidence against free will.
But there are criticisms.
Yes, significant ones, Goff notes. The decisions studied were very trivial, like flicking your wrists whenever you feel the urge. Not exactly like deciding whether to accept a job offer. The relevance to complex, reasoned free will is debatable.
Fair point. He also talks about how panpsychism might lead to a re-enchantment of nature. What's meant by that?
If consciousness is fundamental and widespread, maybe even in plants or simpler organisms, then our relationship with the natural world could change profoundly. It wouldn't just be inert matter governed by blind laws.
We might see plants and ecosystems as having their own kind of inner life.
Perhaps. Goff mentions researchers like Monica Galliano finding evidence of learning in pea plants, or Ariel Novoplansky's work on plant communication. It suggests a richer inner world in flora than we usually assume. Seeing nature as filled with subjects, not just objects, could foster deeper respect and different ethical considerations.
That's a powerful thought. Taking the idea of connection further, he briefly discusses mystical experiences.
Yes. Experiences of unity, formless awareness, oneness with the universe reported across cultures. Thinkers like William James studied these seriously. Goff suggests that if panpsychism is true, these experiences might not just be subjective anomalies.
They could be genuine insights into the fundamentally conscious nature of reality itself.
That's the speculative connection, a glimpse of the underlying unity. Though Goff rightly includes James's caution, these experiences have authority for the individual, but proving their objective truth is another matter.
A balanced perspective. And this all ties into his final point about overcoming cosmic alienation.
Yeah, the feeling some people get from the standard scientific picture that we're just accidental specks of complex chemistry in a vast, indifferent, meaningless universe. Panpsychism, by contrast, puts consciousness right at the heart of reality.
So instead of being alien observers, we're participants in a fundamentally conscious cosmos. It offers a different sense of belonging, perhaps.
That's the potential appeal Goff points towards. A way to find deeper meaning and connection within a scientific worldview, rather than feeling estranged by it.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've seen the limitations Galileo perhaps built into science for tackling consciousness, the serious hurdles for both traditional dualism and materialism.
And the intriguing, though challenging, alternative offered by panpsychism, suggesting consciousness might be far more fundamental than we typically think. It certainly highlights the profound mystery still surrounding subjective experience.
Absolutely. The nature of consciousness clearly remains one of the biggest, most fascinating questions where science and philosophy meet.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder. If consciousness is more fundamental, more widespread in the universe than we usually assume, how might that radically alter how you understand yourself, your place in the cosmos, and even your responsibilities towards the world and everything in it? Something to reflect on.